Arcane is a show that is undeniably political in nature. It's set in a world where two groups of people are in this intense conflict that influences their access to resources and living conditions. That also comes with all the internal struggles that take place over leadership and positions of power. Some viewers go as far as equating the political dynamics of the show to events taking place in our real world today. It's a sentiment that grew even stronger with the release of the second season. Those impressions are reinforced even more thanks to comments made by the creators of the show, who stated that it has taken inspiration from real-life politics. Christian Link specifically drew a direct parallel between Arcane and current political tensions in the United States. He claims that they were inspired by two sides of one nation who are incapable of talking to each other anymore. When we stated this, it was like, yeah, there is a certain inability to coexist, but the election isn't far away and it's only gotten worse. So I think there definitely is a bit of a mirror at the end of the day. In this statement, we see an explicit reference to the divisions marking the current political discourse in the US between the parties that ran for the elections, and which can be reflected in the heated conflict between the people of Piltover and Zon, albeit in this very general sense. Writer Amanda Overton makes a slightly more specific remark by highlighting the economic division that marks the show when she says, "We were always feeling this sort of widening wealth gap just in our lifetimes, and it felt like we could do that in a really inspiring, imaginative, fun way." This comment can more directly reflect contemporary anxieties over the growing wealth gap between the richest 1% and the rest of the population on a universal level, but especially in the United States. Does that mean, however, that these comments make a good case for the argument that Arcane is a reflection of modern-day politics? Well, not exactly. The parallels drawn by the creators here are a bit superficial. If we follow what they say, Arcane reflects the current state of politics in the same way literally any other work or story that centers a conflict between two groups of people is reflective of today's US politics. Not only is division a universal theme that's as old as time, but even within the lore of Arcane itself, the conflict predates the show and finds its roots in the source material, League of Legends, a game that was released more than a decade ago. So not in relation to any recent events. The creators have to get more specific about what current events inspired their show, otherwise their statements risk sounding like a little bit of a stretch. But this is not to say that Arcane's political themes are not relevant today still. They are, nor that the creators are obliged to make them specifically so anyway. What I want to argue here instead is that a bigger inspiration for the politics of the show is found in the past rather than the present. If we feel it directly reflects contemporary issues, it's due to the fact that, on the one hand, some of these issues have always existed and are yet to be resolved, and on the other, history just tends to repeat itself. To understand that, we need to look at the show's genre, or more specifically, subgenre, and that is steampunk. Arcane is a blend of a lot of artistic and fictional subgenres within science fiction and fantasy, but the most prominent one on both fronts is steampunk, as it tends to incorporate retrofuturistic technology and aesthetics inspired by 19th century industry and steam machinery, something that we can see in Arcane. Steampunk is usually set in the Victorian era and during the Second Industrial Revolution. It is this very setting that makes the subgenre usually suitable for social and political commentary. The Industrial Revolution is known to be the fuel to a variety of conflicts that shaped Victorian society, and on top of all of them, we have the social class struggle that led to the emergence of social realism in literature, with writers like Charles Dickens offering critical commentaries on poverty, class division, and the exploitation of the working class. Given that steampunk literature tended to revisit the same era, it shared this social and political dimension. Some works by H.G. Wells that are considered foundational to the subgenre, like The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, similarly contained social critiques addressing class disparity and the consequences of technological advancements. Thus, it wouldn't be unusual for a show like Arcane, which falls under the same subgenre, to emphasize social class conflict. In this case, it's more a result of the nature of steampunk and less of a direct reflection of contemporary politics. If the social class struggle in Arcane is relatable, maybe it's because we're heading towards the same levels of wealth inequality that marked Victorian society. So looking at the show, we're exploring the past in order to process our present. In this steampunk anthology titled Steaming into a Victorian Future, this relation between the past and the present in the subgenre is heavily emphasized. We look to the Victorians, so familiar yet strange, not necessarily to escape the mundane of the present or to romanticize the past, but to understand and negotiate contemporary problems. This quote perfectly echoes viewers' notes on Arcane's politics sounding very familiar. It might not be directly set in the Victorian era, but its steampunk elements and the focus on the consequences of technological development make these parallels resonate all the same. The equivalent in the show is the rapid advancements that resulted from the creation of Hextech technology, which is similar to steam power in the Industrial Revolution, in how it led the city of Piltover to become a pinnacle of technological progress to the detriment of the population of Zon. This creates a huge contrast between the two cities and paints images that are wildly different, despite them being shaped by the same element. The steampunk anthology highlights this duality that resulted from the Industrial Revolution and informed the works of steampunk writers. 19th century science and technology were often characterized by this ongoing conflict of wonder versus horror, the balance between the irrational and the rational, fantasy and realism. The two existed side by side in continual tension as the world around them grappled with notions of progress. The dichotomies listed in this quote are all things we see in Arcane. Hextech is the biggest fuel of both the sense of wonder and horror, which is evident in the interactions between Victor, Jace, and Heimerdinger, who express variations of both emotions as a reaction to the technological advancement that their scientific experiments have led to. The conflict between horror and wonder is embodied best in this key line in the show.
Lost our dream. In the pursuit of great, we failed to do good.
As for rationality and irrationality, the duality is explored through the debates decision-makers in Piltover have over the use of Hextech technology. Heimerdinger specifically presents himself as a voice of rationality that wants to shield the world from the destructive capacities of the technology developed by the seemingly young, irrational Victor and Jace. These conflicts may be inspired by the concerns that dominated the 19th century, but they're still as relevant today as they were at the time. With the recent advancement achieved in artificial intelligence, we too are grappling with how they can alter our reality in ways that can both inspire awe and evoke absolute horror. Once again, this only shows that some of the anxieties we have today have their roots in the past. In this case, starting from the Industrial Revolution, but also through the 20th century. The weaponization of Hextech to create even more destructive tools of oppression in Arcane serves as a reminder of the horrors advancement of science had led to in terms of weaponry, something that was reflected recently in the Oppenheimer biopic, for example. 1 century later, and we're still dealing with the same concerns regarding scientific development. There is this one recent historical fiction book titled The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut, and it does a good job at drawing the links between the different points in the history of science that led to the emergence of one of our deepest concerns today, which is artificial intelligence. The fantasy-realism dichotomy is of course evident in the blend between science and magic that is embodied in Hextech. It is important to note that all of these thematic dualities are also reflected visually, as the show employs a mixture of artistic styles that speak to the conflict at its heart. By virtue of falling under steampunk, it blends science fiction elements with fantasy. Again, we see that in the combination of science and magic in Hextech. It also represents a social class division by portraying Piltover through the Art Deco style that is characterized by geometric shapes, bold colors, and luxurious materials. Meanwhile, Zon is presented with an Art Nouveau style, which is characterized by organic, curving forms and whimsical elements. There's something very steampunk about Arcane in the way it couples its nods to the aesthetics of the past to comment on issues that are highly relevant today. According to the Steampunk Anthology, this emphasis on the social dimension of those aesthetics is a core tenet of the subgenre. Steampunk authors are less concerned with recreating the gas lamp atmosphere of the past than they are with redressing such social issues as prostitution, voting inequalities, pollution, and crime, which dominated Victorian discourse and still speak to contemporary audiences. Steampunk reflects the possibilities for subversion. It is not a mere nostalgia for corsets or fantasies of goggles and dirigibles, but another lens through which to examine the racial, class, and gender politics of both the past and the present. Arcane does indeed go beyond its incorporation of a setting reminiscent of the past and chooses to cover the issues evoked here to varying degrees. It's not particularly subtle about class divisions, as we've mentioned earlier, but it does explore another aspect relevant to both the 19th century and the present day, which is pollution, a phenomenon directly connected to class disparity. In the context of Arcane, the exceptional technological advancements could only happen at the expense of the suffering of the underground's population. The factories developed by Piltover were built directly above Zon, redirecting smog and pollution towards its inhabitants. This led to the formation of this thick and toxic smog known as the Grey, which caused health issues for the residents of Zon. This is highly representative of the Industrial Revolution, where factories released chemicals, smoke, and dust that polluted the air, leading to major health issues threatening factory workers and the general urban population. Needless to say, today we continue to grapple with the environmental consequences of industrialization and the same resultant cycles of disadvantage where poorer communities are the first to experience the impact. The same thing applies to images of crime and prostitution that Arcane paints in the same way steampunk fiction does in its revisits of the Victorian age, where these issues were rampant among the lower class, and that continues to be the case today. Perhaps the only aspects that the show chooses to subvert rather than realistically represent are race and gender politics. Arcane stands out for its depiction of a society that is arguably ideal in its treatment of gender, sexual orientation, and racial differences, as these aspects of the characters' identities are basically irrelevant to the social discussions at its core. People from any race or gender can proportionately belong to any class in this world, and queer relationships seem to be totally accepted and never discussed whatsoever, let alone as an anomaly. Apart from that, Arcane presents a society that is far from ideal in any other capacity. In that, it stays perfectly true to the steampunk tendency to discuss the most pressuring social and political issues that marked the 19th century. It turns out in the end that what is even more troubling than the idea that the show reflects our modern day struggles is the fact that these struggles are not as unique to our age as we might think. Steampunk and Victorian literature have been exploring the same issues for as long as they've existed. Arcane merely follows in their footsteps, as similar concerns continue to be relevant today, with the difference and innovation, of course, lying in the details and the artistic choices with which we prefer to express those same anxieties.